The dawn of the 1930s in Japan was filled with the hum of marching boots and the steady rhythm of schoolyard drills. The empire had found its heartbeat in the synchronized steps of youth. In classrooms where ink once traced poetry, young hands now gripped wooden rifles. The rising sun flag hung above blackboards like a silent overseer, its red circle staring back at the pupils with unwavering authority. Teachers spoke not of individual dreams, but of destiny, a collective path drawn by the emperor's divine light. Children memorized tales of ancient warriors who fell smiling on distant battlefields. They were taught that death for the emperor was not an end, but a transformation, a beautiful shedding of the self into eternal service. By 1937, the war in China had become a constant background hum. Newspapers filled with stories of conquest, never of suffering. The youth of Japan, the boys who once ran through rice fields chasing dragonflies, began to see the military not as an institution of discipline, but as the embodiment of national pride. Aviation clubs flourished in schools. Model planes and technical diagrams replaced literature. The promise of flight seemed to elevate patriotism into something holy. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew the power of imagery. Films produced by state agencies portrayed young pilots laughing under blue skies, their hands resting casually on the fuselages of sleek Zero fighters. These images became fantasies that merged with childhood dreams. The future would belong to those who could fly. The selection of youth cadets began quietly, almost ceremonially. Recruiters visited schools, their uniforms immaculate, their posture perfect. They spoke of adventure and duty. For boys of 16 or 17, the allure was irresistible. Many saw the invitation as proof that they were chosen by destiny. Their parents, burdened by poverty and pride, offered silent bows of acceptance. The training fields were located far from cities, surrounded by forests or endless plains. Reveille sounded before dawn. Cadets learned to fold their blankets with mathematical precision, to salute until their arms trembled, to eat without speaking. Each day was a stripping away of individuality, a careful reshaping of mind and body. When one cadet fell from exhaustion during drills, the others were ordered to run laps until the sunset blurred into night. Obedience was no longer a rule, it became instinct. Among the instructors, a quiet philosophy prevailed. Emotion was weakness, hesitation was treason. The cadets learned to smile at pain, to suppress questions. The war was distant but omnipresent, a mythic struggle told through broadcasts, maps, and slogans. The empire's expansion across Asia was portrayed as liberation, and their coming service as an honor beyond measure. In the airfields near Kagoshima and Sasebo, teenage pilots watched older officers take off in aircraft that shimmered like metallic birds. The roar of engines was intoxicating. To sit in the cockpit was to hold the sky itself. When they practiced with mock targets, they imagined themselves heroes in a vast national game. Their enemy was faceless, an abstract shape drawn on maps and classroom walls. Propaganda turned the Pacific into a chessboard, the Americans into arrogant interlopers who could be outsmarted by Japanese precision and courage. Strategy lessons were presented like puzzles, each victory a matter of intelligence and honor. The line between simulation and reality blurred until the idea of combat felt almost recreational, a challenge to prove devotion. In the late autumn of 1941, whispers spread through the cadet ranks. A great operation was coming, something that would define their generation. The senior officers spoke only in hints about striking a blow so bold that the Western powers would never recover. The young men could only imagine it as another glorious contest. Across the islands, the machinery of war accelerated. Aircraft factories ran through the night, welding the skeletons of planes that would soon carry teenage dreams into the clouds. Mothers stitched good luck flags, their hands trembling as they embroidered sons' names beside slogans of courage. The flags would be tied to cockpits or worn beneath uniforms, talismans for an empire that believed in destiny. The Navy's indoctrination films showed maps with arrows sweeping across oceans, each stroke accompanied by martial music. The Pacific, once a realm of mystery and distance, was reduced to lines and symbols. The young cadets watched these images as if they were instructions for a game they were eager to play. When the code name Operation Z began to circulate among the upper ranks, it carried with it the weight of secrecy and the thrill of competition. Only the highest officers knew the full scope, but fragments reached the training grounds. Hawaii, Pearl Harbor, a strike that would cripple the American fleet. For the young men who would soon fly, it was almost abstract, a chance to test skill, to prove precision. The horror of war had not yet entered their imaginations. They saw only the clean geometry of formation flying, the shimmer of sunlight on metal wings, the exhilaration of being part of something immense. Each morning they saluted the flag and recited oaths that promised loyalty until death. Each evening they wrote letters home that spoke of pride and purpose, not fear. The older instructors, veterans of China, watched them with a quiet melancholy. They had seen the cost of obedience, the faces of men after their illusions were broken. Yet even they could not speak against the tide. As winter approached, snow began to dust the airfields. The cadets continued to train, unaware that within weeks they would cross a line from which none could return. The empire had set its course. The youth of Japan were ready to play their final game, one written not in ink, but in fire and steel. In late November 1941, Japan's decision was sealed in chambers thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of ink. The Imperial General Headquarters had debated for months whether negotiation or surprise would secure the empire's survival. Diplomats continued to meet with American envoys in Washington, their smiles thin and their messages carefully crafted, even as fleets gathered in the North Pacific under the pretense of exercises. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the coming strike, understood the gravity of what was planned. He had studied at Harvard, traveled in the United States, and knew the industrial might Japan was about to provoke. Yet he also knew that hesitation meant strangulation. The oil embargo had cut deep into the empire's veins. Factories sputtered. The Navy's reserves dwindled. To live, Japan had to act before it was too late. The order to assemble the first air fleet came quietly, transmitted through coded phrases and sealed envelopes. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku began to converge in secret bays under heavy camouflage. Their decks became laboratories of precision and discipline. Mechanics tested engines by lamplight, careful to shield even a glimmer from foreign eyes. Every movement was calculated to maintain silence. For the teenage aviators assigned to the task, the days blurred into ritual. Wake before dawn, drill, eat, study target photographs, drill again. They were told only that they were participating in an operation of national destiny. The words Pearl Harbor were rarely spoken aloud. When they appeared in briefings, they were cloaked beneath code names and abstractions. The photographs of the harbor taken months earlier by Japanese intelligence officers posing as tourists showed neat rows of battleships moored like sleeping giants. The young pilots studied these images with the same concentration as a chess master examining a board. Their instructors pointed out the weak points: fuel depots, airstrips, clustered hangars. The cadets nodded and memorized without question. To them, the ships were symbols, not men. The voyage northward was brutal. The task force sailed from Hitokapu Bay under the cover of night on November 26th. The sea was iron cold, the waves relentless. The order was simple: maintain radio silence. Even casual signals could betray the fleet's position. In the dark mess halls, the young aviators whispered among themselves, though they had little to say. They were forbidden to write home. Their letters would be sent only after the mission was complete, if it ever was. Above deck, the world was reduced to gray sky and black sea. The sun rarely appeared. The fleet's course took them through frigid northern waters, where storms hid them from reconnaissance planes. Some pilots began to imagine they were moving through a void, suspended between life and history. When briefings resumed, the tone changed. The instructors no longer smiled. Charts were unrolled across tables. Commanders traced routes toward the Hawaiian Islands, naming coordinates, altitudes, and times. Each unit memorized its role with almost religious focus. The plan was to strike before dawn, when the American defenses were still half asleep. The first wave would target airfields and battleships. The second wave would destroy what remained. For many of the younger pilots, this was the moment the game took its final form. They could see it now, the pattern of attack, the symmetry of movement, the beauty of coordination. Their training had prepared them for perfection, not for blood. The human cost was abstract, invisible beneath the elegance of the plan. On December 1st, the final authorization came from Tokyo. The Emperor himself had approved the operation. Word passed through the fleet like an electric current. Officers gathered their men and read the Imperial rescript aloud, their voices steady despite the biting wind. The document spoke of duty, of the sacred right to self-defense, of the Emperor's unending benevolence. The men bowed deeply, their faces unreadable in the half-light. That night, many wrote in their diaries, some prayed, others simply stared at the sea. In the barracks, the younger ones still whispered of the future of promotions, of victory, of returning home to tell the story. None imagined that their names would soon be engraved on stone memorials. The carriers approached their launch point northeast of Hawaii on December 6th. The weather cleared as if by design. The stars hung motionless above the Pacific. Below deck, the aircraft were armed and fueled. Bombs were loaded, torpedoes checked, propellers spun by hand to prevent freezing. The smell of oil filled the air. The pilots received their final briefings before midnight. A senior officer spoke calmly, his words clipped by discipline. The mission, he said, would open the path for Japan's victory and secure peace for the empire. There would be no retreat, no hesitation. The enemy was unprepared. Success would determine the future of Asia. Afterward, silence. Each man was left with his own thoughts. Some unfolded the good luck flags their mothers had sewn and pressed them against their faces. Others traced the outlines of the islands on maps one last time, memorizing the geography of destruction. At 6 a.m., December 7th, the decks came alive. Engines coughed, then roared. Pilots lined up in the bitter wind, their goggles frosted, their bodies trembling less from cold than from anticipation. Orders were shouted. The first planes were guided to the catapults. Below, sailors formed in ranks, bowing as each aircraft took off. It was a ritual of farewell, though few admitted it aloud. As the first wave lifted into the pale morning, the ocean caught the light of the rising sun, turning the horizon into gold. The formation moved southward in silence, low over the endless Pacific. The pilots checked their instruments, their watches, their navigation marks. Hours passed. The clouds broke, revealing a thin line of land ahead. Hawaii! At that moment, the abstraction began to dissolve. The game was turning into reality. The sun climbed higher, and through the cockpit glass, the young pilots saw the glimmer of ships in the harbor below. The shapes were too clear, too human. They could see decks, flags, movement, smoke rising from morning fires. A city awakening. Their commanders' voices crackled over the radio. Attack signal confirmed. The leader of the first wave tipped his wings toward Oahu. The dive began. At 7:49 a.m., December 7, 1941, the morning sky above Oahu was serene. The island's hills were touched with sunlight, and the harbor below reflected the stillness of a Sunday morning. Church bells began to sound across Honolulu. Families were preparing breakfast, sailors turned in their bunks, and aircraft sat quietly in neat rows along the runways of Wheeler and Hickam fields. Out to sea, 250 miles north, the first wave of Japanese aircraft had already broken from formation and begun their descent toward the island. They approached from the north, through clouds that scattered and reformed like veils. The air was cold and thin. Below them, the Pacific shimmered like glass. The young pilots adjusted their altitude, scanning their instruments with mechanical precision. Their training had brought them to this moment, the culmination of years of discipline and indoctrination. None of them spoke. Each knew his role in the orchestration of destruction. The first group, led by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, moved into formation. Bombers climbed to altitude. Torpedo planes descended toward the harbor mouth. Fighters spread wide to suppress enemy aircraft that never came. At 7:55 a.m., Fuchida signaled the attack. Over the radio, a brief code was transmitted, the message that would mark the beginning of the Pacific War. Below, the stillness shattered. The first torpedoes struck the battleship Oklahoma, tearing open her hull and sending water rushing through the decks. A second hit followed almost instantly. The sound rolled across the harbor like thunder. Men leapt from their bunks, confused, still half asleep, thinking it was a drill or an accident. Within minutes, flames leapt skyward. At the airfields, the assault came with equal suddenness. Japanese dive bombers descended almost vertically, releasing their payloads at precise angles. The explosions tore through hangars, fuel depots, and rows of parked aircraft. In the first minutes, more than 100 American planes were destroyed on the ground. For the Japanese pilots, the harbor below was a mosaic of movement and color. The smoke rose in columns, the ships burned like torches. The geometry of their mission remained intact: target, altitude, release, climb, return. They followed the plan as they had practiced it endlessly. Yet for some, the pattern began to break. Through the canopy, they could see men swimming through burning water. They could see faces. The game was dissolving. The Arizona was hit at 8:06 a.m. A single armor-piercing bomb struck her forward magazine. The explosion that followed consumed the ship in a column of fire visible from miles away. In seconds, over 1,000 men were killed. The blast lifted debris and smoke into the sky, a pillar marking the point where illusion met reality. From above, the young Japanese aviators saw the flash, felt the vibration through their aircraft, and realized the scale of what they had unleashed. The harbor below no longer looked like a target. It looked like a wound. In the second wave, launched at 8:54 a.m., the atmosphere was different. The element of surprise was gone. Anti-aircraft guns blazed from ships and shore batteries. The sky became a storm of smoke and shrapnel. Pilots maneuvered through bursts of fire, their wings rattling with impacts. Some were hit and vanished into the sea. Others pressed forward, releasing their bombs with mathematical calm. The defenders below fought back with whatever weapons they could find. The American gunners, many firing in confusion, managed to bring down several attackers. The Japanese losses mounted, The symmetry of the operation was dissolving into chaos. By 9:45 a.m., the attack was over. The last planes turned northward, their fuel running low, their mission complete. Behind them, the harbor burned. Battleships lay capsized or sinking. Columns of smoke reached into the sky. Nearly 2,400 Americans were dead, most of them sailors caught below deck when the torpedoes struck. For the Japanese aviators returning to the carriers, the exhilaration of success was tempered by fatigue and silence. Some wrote brief notes in their logbooks, others stared at the horizon. They had done what they were ordered to do, perfectly, efficiently. Yet something in the stillness of the ocean seemed to press against them. Admiral Nagumo received their reports with clinical precision. The results exceeded expectation. The fleet's damage was minimal. The losses, 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, 64 men. Strategically, the operation was a triumph. But Nagumo chose not to send a third wave. Fuel reserves were dwindling, and the element of surprise had been spent. He ordered the fleet to turn home. As the carriers moved north again, the young pilots were greeted with subdued congratulations. There were no celebrations. The officers spoke in tones of restrained pride. The success was total, they said. The Empire's path was now open. Yet beneath the words lay an unspoken truth. The world had changed in a single morning. In Tokyo, the news was received first in coded transmissions, then in official reports. Government officials gathered in the Imperial Palace to brief the Emperor. Hirohito listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Outside, the city moved through its day unaware that Japan had crossed the threshold into total war. When the announcement came over the radio the next day, it was framed as a declaration of justice. The Empire of Japan had struck against oppression, against the encirclement by Western powers. Crowds gathered in public squares, waving flags, shouting patriotic slogans. Newspapers printed bold headlines declaring victory. In the military schools and training fields, the cadets who had not yet been deployed cheered. To them, it was proof that their nation was invincible. The images of burning American ships were treated as trophies of skill and devotion. But among the veterans of the first wave, the elation faded quickly. On the return voyage, as the sea stretched endlessly toward Japan, they began to feel the weight of what had happened. Some tried to sleep and failed. Others sat alone on the deck, staring into the cold spray. They had been trained to see the operation as a clean maneuver, a contest of precision. Now, the faces of the dead intruded upon memory. For the United States, the reaction was immediate and unified. Across the Pacific, radio operators relayed the message that would echo through history. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. The war that had begun in that quiet harbor would consume 2 oceans and millions of lives. The young men who had carried out the attack became symbols, in Japan, of courage, in America, of treachery. Yet behind the symbols remained the same truth. They were products of a system that had taught them to obey before they could question. As the Japanese fleet steamed homeward through the empty northern seas, the mood aboard was somber. The officers maintained decorum, but the younger aviators moved like sleepwalkers. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving only exhaustion. For the first time, they were aware of the human cost of precision. When they landed back in Japan, they were met with ceremony. Flags, speeches, photographers. Their names were recorded, their images printed in newspapers. They bowed, smiled, saluted. But in their eyes there lingered something that could not be spoken. The knowledge that the boundary between glory and horror had been crossed, and that they themselves had carried it across. The Empire rejoiced. Factories increased production. Recruits flooded training centers. The illusion of invincibility spread like fire through the nation. For the teenage cadets still waiting for their chance to serve, the war now seemed unstoppable. An endless horizon of opportunity and honor. They could not yet see that the same sky they conquered would, in time, bring ruin back upon their homeland. The weeks after Pearl Harbor unfolded like the crest of a great wave. Japan struck south and west in rapid succession. Hong Kong fell by Christmas. Manila soon after. The British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sunk off Malaya, victims of the same tactics perfected at Pearl Harbor. To the world, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. In the newspapers of Tokyo, maps bloomed with arrows sweeping across half the Pacific. Each advance was framed as liberation, each victory a confirmation of divine favor. In classrooms, children copied the names of conquered cities into notebooks. The young cadets at naval academies studied these maps with awe. They were told that a new age had begun. Asia reborn under Japanese leadership. The West pushed back across the ocean. Yet beneath the triumph, quiet fatigue began to surface. The pace of expansion demanded fuel, steel, and pilots faster than they could be replaced. Many of those trained in the years before the war were already gone, lost over the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, or the Coral Sea. Their replacements were younger, less prepared, driven by slogans more than skill. In 1942, the tide began to shift. The Battle of Midway turned the ocean red and silent. 4 Japanese carriers were lost in a single week, the same vessels that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hundreds of trained aviators vanished into the sea. The blow was irreversible. For the surviving pilots, the war changed character. No longer a clean contest of precision, it became an endurance against loss. They flew longer missions with fewer planes. They watched comrades fail to return, their absence noted in brief reports and erased by new assignments. The once pristine discipline of the training fields gave way to improvisation and exhaustion. At home, the government suppressed news of defeat. Propaganda films still showed smiling pilots climbing into gleaming aircraft, though the real machines were patched with scavenged parts. Mothers continued to sew good luck flags, though cloth had grown scarce. The illusion of the glorious struggle persisted, held together by fear and habit. In the diaries of young airmen, the language began to shift. The early pages, filled with excitement and certainty, gave way to entries marked by fatigue, doubt, and resignation. They no longer wrote of victory, but of endurance, of frost-bitten fingers on controls, of the emptiness of the sky. By 1944, the Empire's perimeter had collapsed. American forces moved inexorably across the Pacific, island by island. The skies that once belonged to Japan now teemed with enemy bombers. Cities that had known only distant war began to burn. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, all became targets. The sound of engines overhead replaced the patriotic songs of the previous years. For the remaining cadets, the command changed. No longer training for victory, they trained for sacrifice. The concept of tokkō special attack units was introduced not as desperation, but as destiny. The notion of death as duty, once an abstract ideal, became operational policy. Teenagers barely out of school were told they could save the Empire by giving their lives. Some accepted without question. Others wrote farewell letters with trembling hands. They were too young to comprehend the full weight of what was asked. Many believed they were continuing the legacy of Pearl Harbor, the decisive blow that could change history. Yet by then, the enemy was prepared, the outcome predetermined. The spring of 1945 brought annihilation. The skies over Japan glowed at night with incendiary fires. Whole districts vanished in hours. The survivors dug through ash for water and rice. In airfields once alive with drills, grass grew between cracked runways. The remaining aircraft were hidden in forests or caves, waiting for missions that would never come. Among the veterans of Pearl Harbor who had survived the intervening years, the sense of triumph had long evaporated. Some commanded the younger tokkō pilots, guiding them toward death with blank expressions. Others flew until their bodies gave out. A few were captured, their silence turning into years of captivity. When the war finally ended, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the Emperor's voice broke through the radio static announcing surrender, the survivors found themselves adrift. The empire that had shaped every breath of their youth no longer existed. The rising sun had set. Japan's cities lay in ruins. Demobilized soldiers walked home through landscapes of ash. In the ruins of schools and barracks, old slogans still clung to the walls, their paint blistered by heat. 100 million hearts as one. The young men who had believed those words were gone, some dead, some returned as ghosts within living bodies. In the years of occupation that followed, silence became the nation's first language. People spoke little of the war. Factories were rebuilt. Children returned to classrooms where the emperor was no longer divine. The veterans were young enough to start again, yet old in ways that could not be measured. A few of the surviving pilots later testified before historians. Their accounts were brief, restrained, almost mechanical. They described coordinates, weather, fuel loads, facts, not feelings. When asked about Pearl Harbor, many used the same phrase, "We believed we were playing a game of skill." Only later, as they saw photographs of the dead and the wreckage, did they understand what that game had meant. The transformation of Japan from empire to democracy required the erasure of many myths. The image of the noble young warrior faded into discomfort. The films and textbooks that once glorified sacrifice were replaced with lessons on peace. Yet the faces of those boys, captured in photographs before their final flights, remained fixed in the public imagination. Neither heroes nor villains, but the embodiment of a nation that had mistaken obedience for destiny. Decades later, on quiet mornings in Honolulu, visitors still gather at the USS Arizona Memorial. The surface of the harbor is calm again, sunlight flickering on the water that covers the remains of the ship. Oil still seeps upward in slow, iridescent trails. The tears of the Arizona, as locals call them. The names engraved on the white marble are reflected faintly in the water below. Across the ocean in Japan, small memorials stand near airfields long abandoned. Stone markers list the names of the pilots who departed and never returned. Most were 19 or 20 years old. Their families, now scattered across generations, leave offerings of paper cranes and photographs. The grass grows tall around the stones. Historians still debate the meaning of that first strike, whether it was inevitable, whether it sealed Japan's fate. What remains beyond debate is the human cost hidden beneath the statistics, the lives built on obedience, the education of children for war, the transformation of play into destruction. The story of the teenage aviators is not one of villains or saints. It is a study in how a nation teaches its youth to see the world not as it is, but as it wishes it to be. In the early 1940s, Japan taught its children that to die for the emperor was beautiful. The United States taught its own youth that to avenge Pearl Harbor was righteous. Between those beliefs lay millions of graves. When the last survivors grew old, some began visiting schools to speak, not of glory, but of caution. They described the simplicity of their lives before the war, the games they played, the fascination with airplanes. They told students how easily that fascination was turned into a weapon. Their words carried no anger, only quiet astonishment at their younger selves. In one recorded interview, a former cadet summarized it in a single sentence. "We thought it was a game until the bombs fell." It was not an excuse, but a confession, an acknowledgment that faith in the machinery of destiny had blinded a generation. The Pacific today is calm again, its surface reflecting the same light that guided those planes in 1941. The islands remain, the oceans indifferent. The echo of engines has long since faded, yet the lessons endure. History, when told without ornament, is not a story of victories or defeats. It is a record of choices made by those too young to know their consequences, and so the chronicle ends where it began, in the minds of children taught to salute the sun, unaware that it could burn.